The barrel glowed. Not red the way a stove ring glows, but a dull, sullen orange that a man could see through the falling snow, and private first-class steam rising off it wherever a flake landed and died. He had fired long enough that the water in the jacket around the barrel had boiled dry, and now the metal was cooking itself, and the front sight had begun to shimmer and lean, the way a fence post leans in heat haze. His hands smelled of hot gun oil and burnt cloth from the asbestos mitt that had scorched through. Down the slope, across 300 yards of open white ground, the gray shapes kept coming, and every time he pressed the butterfly trigger, the belt fed, and the shapes fell, and more shapes rose behind them. The sound did not stop. It had not stopped for the better part of an hour, and to the men crawling toward him through the snow, that unbroken hammering was the single most important fact in the world. Because a machine gun that never pauses does something to the mind of the man advancing into it. A rifleman can be waited out. He must work his bolt. He must find a target. He must breathe. A machine gun in trained hands fires in bursts of 6 to 9 rounds, then rests because the gunner knows his barrel will warp if he does not let it cool. Every German infantryman had been taught to count that rhythm, to move in the pauses, to rush the gun while it caught its breath. This gun gave no pauses. And that is the whole of what I want to lay in front of you today. The small impossible thing that a handful of enemy soldiers wrote about years later without ever quite explaining it. How one American, alone on a rise of snow, held a position that doctrine said needed a squad and kept firing until his own weapon deformed in his hands rather than yield the ground behind him. If stories like this one matter to you, do the small thing that keeps them alive. Subscribe to the channel, hit the like, and if your family carried a name from these winters, put it in the comments where the rest of us can read it. These men are nearly all gone now. The record is what we have left of them, and the record is worth keeping. The place was the Ardennes, in the 3rd week of December, 1944, though the exact rise of ground and the exact hour are the sort of details that the after-action reports smudge and the survivors remembered differently. Snow had been falling on and off for days, the wet, heavy kind that soaks through wool and freezes at the seams, and the temperature at night dropped low enough that men found their canteens turned to ice and the oil in their weapons thickened to glue. Into that cold, the German army had thrown everything it had left in the West, a last great gamble, 20 divisions moving through the forest to split the American line and race for the River Meuse and the fuel dumps beyond it. The men coming across the snow toward that one gun were not conscripts, and they were not fools. Many of them were veterans of the Eastern Front, hardened by 3 winters against the Soviets, and they attacked with a professional competence that American officers respected even as they killed them. They knew how to use dead ground. They knew to come at first light when the gunner's eyes were tired. They had done this before, against better odds than these, and they had won. What they did not expect, what the survivors circled back to again and again in the years afterward, was the volume. A German rifle squad in the assault could put out a certain weight of fire, built around a single fast-firing machine gun that spat so quickly it sounded like tearing canvas. The men called it a buzzsaw, and it frightened the Americans who first heard it. But that weapon paid for its speed. Its barrel had to be swapped every 250 rounds, or it would burn out, and a good crew could change one in seconds, precisely because they had to, constantly, all day. The American gun on the snowbank fired slower, a heavy, deliberate pounding that a man could almost count, 450 rounds a minute against the Germans' 1,200, and by every measure on paper, it should have been the weaker weapon. One of the men who crawled toward it, a sergeant who lived to be interrogated, put the confusion plainly to an American officer months later. "We could not understand," he said, "why it did not stop to cool. We waited for the pause. The pause did not come." He had counted on the rhythm his whole war. The rhythm was the doorway, and the doorway never opened. So here is the question. The rest of this is going to answer, and I promise you, it has an answer, because men on both sides left enough behind to reconstruct it, to understand why that gun did not stop, why the barrel warped instead of the gunner breaking. We have to go back before the snow, to a design argument in an American arsenal, and to the water-cooled logic that a stubborn ordnance department refused to give up. It starts with the gun itself, 31 pounds of gun, and every ounce of it machined to be simple. John Browning had drawn the thing up before the First War. A rectangular receiver you could almost mistake for a lunchbox with a barrel, feeding a woven cloth belt of 250 cartridges from a can on the left. The M1919 was the air-cooled child of that older water-cooled design, and the men who carried it trusted it the way you trust a hammer. It had a personality they knew. Pull the bolt handle twice, thumb the trigger, and it spoke in that slow, flat hammer. The Germans on the snowbank could not wait out. In a heated armory in Ohio, it was one of the most reliable weapons any army had ever fielded. The Ardennes was not a heated armory. Cold is not a single problem. It is a dozen small betrayals arriving together, and the men learned each one the hard way. Start with the oil. The lubricant the Ordnance Department issued for the gun was blended for temperate weather, and somewhere below zero, it stopped behaving like oil and started behaving like tar. The bolt that should have slammed forward under spring pressure instead crept, dragging through gum that had been grease at noon and glue by midnight. A gun that short strokes does not fire. It jams, half-fed, the belt hanging slack. Crews figured out the fix on their own, wiping the actions nearly dry, running them with almost no lubricant at all, because a bone-dry gun in that cold ran better than a wet one. The manuals had not told them that. The winter did. Then the metal itself. Steel gets brittle as the temperature falls, and firing pins and extractors that would flex and hold at room temperature could snap clean at 30 and 40 below. An extractor is a small hooked part, no bigger than a house key, and its whole job is to pull the spent brass out of the chamber so the next round can enter. Snap that hook, and the gun swallows its own empty case and chokes. Men carried spares in their breast pockets, against the skin, because a firing pin warmed by body heat was a firing pin less likely to shatter. That is the level the war had come down to on that ridge. A soldier keeping a sliver of steel warm against his ribs, the way you might keep a chick alive. The belt was its own enemy. The M1919 fed from woven cloth, and cloth in the Ardennes did what cloth does in wet cold. It soaked, and then it froze. A belt left lying in the snow came up stiff as a plank. The cartridges locked in fabric turned to cardboard, and it would not flex around the feed sprocket. The gun tried to pull a frozen ribbon through a curved path and tore, or stopped. So the men kept the belts under their coats, in their armpits, coiled the loaded cans close to whatever body heat they had, and fed the gun from the warmth of their own chests, one belt at a time. Every cartridge that killed a German on that slope had first been thawed against an American torso. And the ammunition, once it entered the gun, brought the opposite disaster. Fire long enough and fast enough, and the barrel does not stay cold. It climbs the other way, past warm, past hot, to the sullen orange from the opening of this story. The air-cooled M1919 was built to shed that heat through the metal itself and through pauses in the shooting. Take away the pauses, and the physics turns on you. A barrel held at high heat softens, and the rifling that spins the bullet begins to wear away with every round, and the steel itself can droop under its own weight if it is hot enough and unsupported long enough. Fire a few hundred rounds without stopping, and you are cooking the one part of the gun that cannot be kept warm in a pocket, because the problem now is that it will not get cool. Here is the trap the man on the snowbank was standing in, and I want it clean in your head before we go further. Every instinct the cold gave him said fire more to keep the action from freezing, fire more to keep the belt moving, fire more because the gray shapes kept rising, and stopping meant dying. But firing more was the one thing guaranteed to warp the barrel. The winter demanded he keep shooting to stay alive. The gun demanded he stop shooting to stay whole. Those two demands could not both be met, and he had perhaps an hour before the contradiction came due. The Germans crawling up the slope were fighting the same 40 below war, and their fast little buzzsaw hated the cold as much as his Browning did. Their oil froze the same way, and their fingers went as white and stupid as his. That is worth saying plainly, because this was not a story of a warm American against a suffering enemy. Both sides were freezing men, working frozen machines in the dark, and both knew the machines could quit at any second. The difference was in what each gun could bear, and how long, and at what cost. One of them had been designed with a stubborn margin of endurance built into its very bones, and that margin came out of an argument in an American arsenal 30 years before the snow ever fell. The men who won that argument never saw the Ardennes. But their fingerprints were all over that barrel. Kampfgruppe Peiper had the best roads and the worst luck. The spearhead of the 6th Panzer Army came west out of the Losheim Gap with orders that read like a stopwatch: seize the bridges, take the fuel, reach the Meuse before the Americans woke up. Speed was the whole plan. Speed was also the thing the Ardennes refused to give, because the ground the Germans had chosen precisely for its weak defenses was a country of narrow forest roads, single-track bridges, and villages built where 3 lanes crossed. An army in a hurry through that terrain does not spread out. It threads, and a thread can be cut at any one of 100 points by a single man who will not move. That is the arithmetic that turned ordinary crossroads into the hinge of the whole battle. The German plan needed junctions, the way a body needs joints, and every junction was a place where one American gun could make an entire column stop, dismount, and fight on foot for ground it had expected to drive straight through. Look at how the line actually came apart in those first days. The German assault fell on a stretch held thin, green divisions resting after weeks in the line, brand new units that had never heard a shot, frontages so wide that companies held ground meant for battalions. In many places, there was no continuous line at all, just strong points with cold air between them. When the barrage lifted before dawn on the 16th and the gray infantry came out of the fog, whole sections of the American front simply dissolved. Command posts lost contact with their platoons inside an hour. Runners went out and did not come back. The telephone wire, strung through the trees, was cut or frozen or blown, and radios that worked in Ohio went deaf among the wet hills. What was left when the wire went dead and the officers lost the picture was the man behind the gun. This is the part the after-action reports state almost without drama, and it is the truest thing in them. With the line broken into islands, the defense of the Ardennes came down to hundreds of small positions that could no longer be commanded, only held or lost, and at the center of a great many of those positions sat a Browning on a tripod, and 2 or 3 men who had decided the road behind them mattered more than the odds in front. The heavy machine gun was not one weapon among many now. It was the position. Take away the gun, and the riflemen around it were a handful of cold men with carbines. Keep the gun firing, and 30 attackers had to respect it, work around it, bleed for it. The Germans understood this better than anyone, because their own doctrine was built on exactly the same truth. Their assault tactics existed to solve the machine gun. Rush it in the pause, flank it through dead ground, pin it with the buzzsaw, while a rifle team crawled a grenade into range. They had drilled the answer to a Browning 1,000 times. What they had not drilled was a Browning that gave no pause to rush into. At a crossroads, their timetable could not afford to leave standing, defended by a man who had done the same brutal math they had, and reached the same answer from the other side. And the timetable was everything. Peiper's fuel was measured, his bridges were numbered, and every hour a crossroads held meant German tanks idling on a forest road, burning gasoline they could not replace, backed up nose to tail, waiting for the infantry ahead to clear one gun off one rise of snow. The reports on the German side used the word again and again in translation: delay, delay, delay. A junction that should have cost 20 minutes cost 6 hours. A bridge that should have been seized intact was blown, while a machine gun kept the engineers pinned in a ditch 200 yards short of it. Multiply that by a dozen crossroads across the front, and the great gamble began to run out of the one thing it could never manufacture more of, which was time. So the picture on that snowbank in the opening showed more than one brave man. It was the shape of the whole battle in miniature. Across 50 miles of broken front, the same scene repeated with different faces. A gun on a rise, a road behind it, gray shapes in front, and an American deciding that the arithmetic of one against many still favored him as long as the barrel held and the belt fed. The line had not held because of a line. It held because of 1,000 small refusals to yield a piece of ground that a map said was worthless and a timetable said was everything, which brings the whole thing back to the barrel. Every one of those refusals ran on the same physics our gunner was fighting on his rise. The same frozen belts thawed against the same chests, the same oil wiped dry, the same steel climbing toward orange. The defense of the Ardennes was, in the plainest mechanical sense, a bet that American machine guns could out-endure the German timetable. It was a bet placed not by the men firing them, but by engineers and ordnance officers who had argued about heat and water and cooling decades before, in rooms far from any snow. To understand whether that bet paid off on the Snowbank, we have to go and listen to that argument. 0640, and the light was the color of dirty milk. Gefreiter Wolfgang. The FMS interrogators recorded his rank, but smudged the surname, and the file gives no more than that. Had crossed the first 200 yards on his belly, one shove of the boots at a time. In the gap the mortars were supposed to have torn open. The gap was there. The gun in it was not supposed to be. He had listened for the break in the firing, the way he had been taught since basic, the count of 6 or 9, and then the little silence where a man rushes 10 meters and drops. He had that count in his body deeper than his own pulse. On this slope, the count kept running past 9, past 20, past any number that made sense, and there was no silence to rush into, only the flat, hard pounding and the snow kicking up in a line that walked toward him and stopped and walked back. Behind that sound, on the rise, one American was doing something the arithmetic said was impossible. He was firing in long killing bursts now, not the disciplined taps of a fresh gun with a full crew, because his crew was gone, or hauling ammunition, and the flank positions that should have carried part of the load had gone quiet one after another through the morning. First, the gun to his left, 100 yards off in the tree line, had hammered along with him and then simply stopped, out of belt, or the crew hit, or the action frozen solid. The report never says which. Then, the strong point on the right thinned to rifle fire, and then to nothing. Each time a friendly gun fell silent, more of the gray shapes shifted toward the one that had not, because the one that had not was the one killing them, and the only way to kill it was to close on it. So he fired more. Firing more was the trap from the second section come due, and he had no way out of it that did not run straight through the barrel. The spare barrels were the thing that should have saved the gun, and did not. A heavy machine gun crew was issued spares precisely so a man could pull a cooked barrel and slam a cool one home in under a minute and keep the position alive by rotating steel the way the Germans rotated their buzzsaw barrels all day long. But the spares traveled with the tripod and the ammunition and the second and third men, and in a line broken into islands those things scattered. Some spares were back with a jeep that could not get forward. Some were in a musette bag on a man lying face down in the snow 40 yards behind the gun. The records do not tell us which applied on this rise. What they tell us is the result the German survivors described. A gun that should have paused to change its barrel every few hundred rounds instead ran on the one barrel it had, because the man behind it had nothing to swap in and nowhere to send for more. So the barrel climbed, past hot, past the point where the oil smoked off it, past the point where a hand near the metal felt the heat like an open stove, up to the sullen orange the whole story opened on. A barrel that hot does not shoot straight. The rifling wears with every round. The bullets begin to key and tumble. The point of aim wanders as the steel softens and sags a fraction of a degree under its own weight. He was no longer placing rounds with any precision. He did not need precision. He needed a wall of moving metal across 200 yards of open snow, and a warped orange barrel throwing tumbling bullets in a rough cone still made that wall, still made a man on his belly out there decide to stop and press his face into the snow rather than take the next 10 meters. That is the part the attackers could not file into any category they owned. One of them, questioned weeks later behind the lines, gave the American interrogator a sentence that survived in the report. "We thought it was 2 guns, then 3. It was 1. A man does not fire 1 gun that long. It is not possible." He was not paying a compliment. He was describing a thing that broke the rules he had staked his life on, and the only way his mind could hold it was to assume more guns than were there, more men than were there, anything but the truth of one American who would not stop when every law of the weapon said he must. Wolfgang got to within perhaps 80 meters. He remembered the heat shimmer over the muzzle, even through the falling snow, the way the air above the gun wobbled like the air over a road in August, and he remembered thinking, with a clarity that frightened him afterward, that the man up there had decided to burn the gun to slag before he would give up the road. The barrel was glowing. The sound had not stopped, and somewhere in the next few minutes, the steel was going to make the choice the gunner had refused to make for himself. The steel gave somewhere in the 8th or 9th belt, and it did not announce itself. There was no crack, no burst, none of the drama a man might expect from a gun eating itself. The barrel simply began to droop. A few thousandths of an inch of sag at the muzzle, where the metal had gone soft as warm wax, and the rounds that had been throwing a wall 200 yards out started climbing and spreading and losing their voice. A bullet leaving a warped bore does not fly, it staggers. Wolfgang, flat in the snow at 80 meters, heard the sound change, the hard, flat hammer thickening into something wet and wrong, rounds going wide over his head, with a wobble he could hear, a fluttering whine no rifleman ever forgets, and none of them could name. He thought, for one bright second, that the gun was finished. It was not finished. That is the thing the survivors kept circling in the reports, the detail none of them could make sit flat. The barrel was warping, and the man behind it knew it, and he did not stop to save the weapon. He fed the next belt. The Browning kept firing through its own ruin, throwing tumbling metal in a cone that no longer killed cleanly, but still filled the air over the open ground with the promise of it. And a man on his belly cannot tell a wobbling bullet from a straight one when both of them are passing a hand's width above his helmet. The wall had gone ragged. It had not come down. And the German Count, the Count Wolfgang carried deeper than his pulse, still found no silence to rush into. The physics in those minutes was working on all of them, and the men out in the snow felt every part of it without the words for it. Steel does not fail all at once. It yields. Held above roughly 1,000 degrees, the barrel of an air-cooled gun loses the hardness that keeps the rifling sharp and the bore straight, and it begins to obey gravity and pressure instead of the machinist who cut it. Each round now scoured a little more of the softened lands away, so each round flew worse than the one before, and the gun walked itself down a ramp toward the moment it would fire its last useful shot. A crew with a spare would have swapped steel 3 barrels ago and never met this ramp. He had no spare. He rode the ramp all the way down, and he did it on purpose, because the alternative was to hand Wolfgang and the men beside him the 10 meters they needed. The smell reached the German before the end did. Scorched oil, hot brass, and under it, the flat mineral reek of steel cooked past any temper. A smithy smell, an August road smell, wrong in a place that was 40 below and white to the horizon. Snow was falling on the muzzle and leaving a steam, and the shimmer over the gun bent the tree line behind it, like heat over a griddle. Wolfgang would tell the interrogator, weeks later and through a translator, that he had smelled the gun before he could have possibly reached it, and that the smell was the thing that told him a human being was still up there choosing to burn. That interrogation is the reason we have any of this at all, and I want to be straight about what it is and is not. It is a German account, given by frightened men to American officers who wanted to understand what had chewed up an assault, and men in that chair shade the truth toward whatever keeps them fed and alive, but the shape of it repeats across more than one prisoner, and the repeated shape is the tell. They did not describe being beaten by numbers. They described being beaten by one. It was one gun, a squad leader said in the report that survives, and it should have stopped. Everything we knew said it must stop. It did not stop, and so we did not go. That is not a soldier praising his enemy. That is a soldier explaining a defeat he could not otherwise explain to himself, and reaching, against every instinct, for the only account that fit. The gun fired its last that mattered somewhere in the gray full light of morning. The records do not give the minute. They do not give the count of rounds, and the men who could have counted were dead or captured, or simply gone into the anonymous flood of that winter. What the German accounts agree on is that the fire from the rise slackened and then guttered out, and that by the time it did, the moment for a rush had passed. The timetable had bled away. The column behind them had backed up on its own fuel, and other guns down the line had bought the same expensive minutes the same expensive way. When the gray infantry finally worked up onto the position, some accounts say they found the gunners still there, and some say the snowbank was empty but for the gun. Both cannot be true. One of them is, and the file does not settle it. The barrel they found was ruined past any reissue, drooped and pitted and blued black with heat, a piece of scrap that had done in one morning what no ordnance table ever asked of it. It had warped instead of the man. That was the whole bet. Placed 30 years before in an arsenal argument nobody on that snowbank had heard, and it had just come due, and it had paid. The cordite hung in the hollow after the gun quit, a sharp, acrid ghost that would not settle in the still cold, and mixed with it the sweeter rot of scorched cloth where the last belt had smoked against the feed. That was the first thing the German infantry noticed as they came up over the lip of the rise, weapons ready for a fight that was already over. The smell of the place, cordite and burnt oil and blood gone half frozen, laid over snow churned brown and red for 50 yards in front of a single tripod. They came up slow. Men who have paid that kind of price for 100 meters of ground do not rush the last of it. What they found in front of the gun is the part the report set down in plain numbers, and the numbers are their numbers, not mine. The gray shapes lay where the wall of metal had caught them, some in the folds of dead ground they had thought would hide them, some out in the open where the count had failed them and the rush had died halfway. The FMS material and the interrogation summaries that touch this action do not agree on a figure, and I will not hand you a false one. One account speaks of better than a company's worth of casualties spread across the morning's attacks on that stretch. Another, narrower, counts only the men in front of the one gun and still runs to dozens. The precise tally died with the officers who would have filed it. What every version shares is the shape of the thing. The attackers lost more men taking that rise than the rise, by any map a staff officer would draw, was ever worth. He was still there. The accounts that put a body on the position describe it without ceremony, the way tired men describe what they have seen too much of, and I trust that flatness more than I would trust a flourish. The gunner had not run. He had gone down at or near the gun, in the churned snow behind the ruined barrel, and the Germans who reached him understood at once what they were looking at, because they had spent the morning being schooled by it. There is a line in one of the post-war reports, a German officer reaching for the American he never met, and it survives in translation, stripped of everything but the fact. The position, he wrote, had been held by a single machine gunner, and the men who took it counted their dead and did not feel they had won anything. That is a soldier's arithmetic. It is the coldest praise there is, and it is the truest. The barrel told its own half of the story to anyone who bent to look. Drooped at the muzzle like a candle left too near the stove, blued black and bruised purple where the heat had walked up the steel, the bore scoured smooth of the rifling that had made it a rifle at all. It was a bar of ruined metal that had been a weapon 4 hours before. A German armorer, if one stood in that group, would have known exactly what he was seeing, and exactly what it had cost to make steel do that, because their own guns wore barrels out the same way, and were saved from this only by the spares their doctrine kept close. This gun had no such mercy engineered around it that morning. It had a man instead, and the man had spent the barrel the way the barrel was built to be spent, down past every tolerance the arsenal ever stamped on it, to the exact edge where the steel failed a breath before the position did. I have read the argument that this kind of stand changed nothing, that one gun on one rise is a rounding error against army groups and fuel tonnages and the great cold ledger of the offensive. I think that argument is wrong, and I think it is wrong in a way that matters. Peiper did not fail for want of courage or want of steel. He failed for want of hours, and hours were exactly what 1,000 positions like this one took from him, one warped barrel at a time, until the timetable that was the whole gamble simply ran dry on a forest road with the Meuse still out of reach. The bet the ordnance men placed 30 years earlier, that a barrel could be made to endure longer than the man behind it would break, came due on 10,000 snowbanks that December, and it paid on nearly all of them. The snow took the rest and kept it. The gunner's name is not in the fragment of record that carries Wolfgang's account, because the men who wrote that record were the enemy, and the enemy does not learn the names of the men who kill them. Somewhere in an American casualty file, there is a name to match this rise, and the two papers were never laid side by side, so I cannot give you who he was. I can give you what he did, on the authority of the men who tried to cross the ground in front of him, and could not, which is a harder authority to argue with than any medal citation. They buried their own in the days that followed, when the ground could be worked. The barrel went to scrap, and the snow that had steamed off it all morning closed over the churned red ground by nightfall, white and level again, as though the arithmetic had never been solved there at all. A barrel is cheaper than a man, ran the old ordnance saw, and the men who cut that Browning steel in the arsenal argument decades before had meant it as a design creed, not a eulogy. On the snowbank that December, it read the other way around. The barrel had been spent to save the position, And the position had held because the barrel could be spent, because somebody 30 years earlier had built a weapon a single frightened soldier could ruin honestly all the way down without the gun quitting on him first. That is the inversion the Germans carried off that rise and never fully unpacked. The warped steel looked like a broken thing. It was the opposite. It was a system working exactly as designed, right to the edge of destruction, in the hands of the one part of the system no arsenal could manufacture. Wolfgang lived. That much the file gives us, because the file is his. He was taken west into the American rear in the weeks that followed, one of tens of thousands funneled back through the cages, and somewhere in that process he sat across from an interrogator and tried to explain the morning that had chewed his company apart. The account exists because he could not let it go. That is the tell I keep coming back to. A man does not volunteer, through a translator, the story of the enemy who beat him unless the thing has lodged in him past the reach of pride. He counted past 20, described the smell before the ground, and admitted assuming 2 guns, then 3, because 1 was not a number his training allowed. And in doing so, he built, without meaning to, the most complete monument that American gunner would ever get, assembled by the enemy, out of fear, and filed in a language the gunner never spoke. What the Germans could not outshoot and could not outlast lies plain here. They could match the steel. German barrels were superb, their machine guns faster firing than anything the Americans carried, their doctrine of rotating spares smarter on paper than a lone gun with no crew. On raw metal, the Wehrmacht armorer had the better argument, and I will not pretend otherwise. What they could not match was the arrangement behind the metal, a gun simple enough to fight alone, sighted over ground a rifleman could read, fed by a supply chain that had put a can of belted ammunition within a dying man's reach when everything else on the line had scattered. The German who reached the tripod understood the weapon in his hands the moment he saw it. What he could not reconstruct was the whole apparatus that had delivered one stubborn American to that spot with enough belt to make the morning cost what it cost. The barrel itself did not survive, and I have looked. There is no relic Browning from that specific rise sitting under glass anywhere, no drooped and blackened bore with a placard and a name. Guns cooked past use were not kept. They were surveyed, condemned, and hauled back to the ordnance dumps that fed the great scrap economy of the theater, where warped barrels went into the furnaces, along with shell casings and shot-up jeeps and the split armor of tanks. The metal that held the Snowbank was almost certainly melted down within the year and poured back out as something else. More barrels, more track, more of the endless American steel that buried the German offensive under its own weight. The object became the flood it came from. That is the closest thing to a fate the record allows. A Browning M1919 of the same pattern, the same lunchbox receiver, the same cloth belt, the same barrel John Browning drew before the First War, sits today in the collection at the Ordnance Museum, and in a dozen others besides, behind rope, cool to the touch, its bore straight and sharp, and never once fired past its temper. 10,000 of its brothers went to the furnace hot. This is the arithmetic of the whole thing, and I will give it to you the way the records give it to me, without dressing it up. 1 gun, 1 barrel, ruined past reissue in a single morning. one man at the trigger after the crew was gone, firing through the 8th or 9th belt while the steel drooped in his hands. A German company that paid by its own count dozens of men for a rise a staff officer would not have valued at one. A spearhead that failed for want of hours, and 1,000 positions like this one that took those hours a warped barrel at a time. A name that exists in an American casualty file nobody ever laid beside the German report, so that the man who did this is known to us only through the enemy who could not get past him. The gun failed at the muzzle, on schedule, doing precisely what it was built to do. The man behind it did not fail at all. The Germans took the ground and understood, standing on it, that they had not won it, and one of them carried the story west and gave it to the people whose gunner had stopped him, which is how any of it reaches you now. The barrel went to the furnace, the account went to the file. The road to the Meuse stayed closed.